Wes and Ted's Excellent Conversation, a podcast about teaching, learning, and anything else that pops into Wes and Ted's heads. It's funny, I was about to say I'm feeling very low energy, which is kind of funny because I think on most people's, sort of scale or spectrum, what I consider to be low energy, they consider to be relatively normal and grounded instead of kind of a sort of semi-manic guide.
What is it like? What is it like to be normal? I can't say I'm familiar.
Okay, fair. Insofar as this is a fair what's the word I'm looking for? A fair example of being normal. It's calming. It sounds nice. It pauses between the sounds. I feel as though I should be whispering into the microphone in a very calming way, but it's not my skill set. So
that's not okay. It's not bad. If we're going to do a meditation podcast instead, I do have some notes. Just a couple of tone things I learned from Headspace. Headspace, that guy, basically.
Oh my gosh, Headspace! Holy mackerel! I haven't done that in a while, but I got a lot of value out of it when I was doing it for sure.
I like it. I've done it twice. I totally appreciate it, and I mean, I know that meditation helps give you discipline, but you also need discipline in order to do meditation.
Pretty tricky, chicken and egg thing.
It sure is. It is. Yeah. It's problematic. Let's tell them why you might be low energy. Wes, why might you be low energy today?
Yes, exactly. Now I feel pressured to come up with a false but funny reason. But in fact, I got my second COVID-19 shot yesterday and slept poorly last night as a direct result, in my view. And so now I'm feeling like, oh boy, wow.
Yeah.
All I'm thinking is if this is a shadow of what the actual malady feels like, then oh man, that's no joke.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is, right? Because it's basically like your body responding to a partial dose, a manageable dose that only takes say 24 hours to respond to, but it's what you're feeling is your immune system responding to it, and that's exactly what it would do to the real virus too, only over the course of 2 weeks rather than one day. So pretty bad.
Yeah. What's pretty funny is that you called it manageable, and it's like, wow, that is not the word that comes to mind given my sort of lived experience in this moment. And yet, of course, completely true. And it's so funny because so much of that, I'm totally pivoting here. I feel like, that sort of manageable but real discomfort in service of being more resilient, like that is one of the major watchwords of our professional work, I think, when we're working with students and preparing them for various admissions tests, math competitions, and so on. Like there is something to be said for the idea of, put the student or the competitor in a position of stress that is manageable in order that he or she can sort of come to understand what it feels like and deal with it successfully.
Yeah, preparation for discomfort, basically, you know what I mean? Like anticipation of it and not rejecting it, I mean, basically just saying like, this is actually, the discomfort I'm feeling is actually worthwhile. There's a good reason to feel this. And in fact, like it's very normal and natural to feel it.
I had a physically active day and now I'm sore at the end of the day. It's like, well, reframe that as, okay, that's a good sign, even though it's not actually a pleasant feeling on its face. And the same thing is going on here. But the thing that really grabs me is that I'm so accustomed to, to kind of being the cheerleader in that situation. Okay, yeah, I know it's uncomfortable. We're going to push through it. But now that I'm in the middle of it, it's like, oh, right, this is capital D discomfort. Like this is not just a set it aside and ignore it. This is a, part of your energy goes to fighting it. And that's the level of discomfort you need if you're going to adapt. Something that you can easily ignore is not necessarily training your defenses appropriately. I mean, it's interesting.
A couple of thoughts on that. One is I was so relieved when when I started feeling those symptoms, because it was like, oh, this shot is doing something. You know what I mean? Like this shot is actually is definitely working.
Yep, no placebo effect. That's for darn sure.
The other thing is I got my second shot. The first shot, I was fine. I had a sore arm, like a very sore arm for 5 days. But part of that was because I drove to Bakersfield, California, which was about 3 hours away. And I literally woke up early, drove there, got my shot, got back in the car, drove back, and that was the...
Oh, so you were using your shoulder muscles for 6 hours around the shot.
You know, it's interesting. I would say I was almost perfectly not using my shoulder muscles because it was my left shoulder and I'm driving and, and it's my arm's kind of sitting here and I'm just got my hands on the wheel and it's like basically in isolation. And I think I don't know if it just kind of like sat in there and got kind of, gummed up or something like that. But I had like a welt later on, like a big welt that lasted like
wow, no kidding.
A couple weeks. Yeah. And it was fine. But the second shot, I got it at 4:15 p.m. and at 3 a.m. the next, morning, I woke up with the thought, ouch. Literally, my eyes opened and it was like, oh, I just woke up because I'm in pain. So, that's...
Yeah, you and I talked about it, and I promised myself and said to you that I'd go to bed early, and then what did I do? I did not do that, and sure enough, in my case, it was 14 or 15 hours after the morning shot, where it was just like, oh yeah, the last time I felt this, I had a pretty serious flu, like I was shivering and like the whole 9 yards, and it was just like, okay, I hope this stops, and it did not.
yeah. Chills are weird. Chills are interesting, aren't they? It's such a strange, yeah.
Well, one of the things that I find so interesting about it is it's a piece of your sort of I'm going to get it all wrong, right? There's a certain homeostasis, right? Your body is working to maintain an equilibrium, right? And you don't have any sense that it's doing any work. Like if you're cold, it warms you up. If you're warm, it cools you. Like you sweat or you whatever. Like there's just this stuff that's happening that you're not aware of all that stuff that's happening, right? Until it turns off. And you're like, oh, this is what it would be like not to have that automatic system supporting me 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's like, almost perfectly functioning, right? Yeah, and because it's perfectly functioning, we don't notice it. That actually reminds me of another kind of vaccine-related thing. That basically one reason that people are very resistant to the vaccine, or not very resistant, but some people are very resistant to the vaccine, is because of the success of earlier vaccines, and basically they don't realize how good they've got it. You know what I mean? That they basically...
I don't know what you mean. Tell me more.
No one has rubella, is what I mean. Basically, like except in weird anti-vax cases, no one has measles or mumps, right? Basically, like the vaccines, they do work, and so because people don't get those illnesses, they don't realize how effective their treatment has been. And so when this,
I see. So in other words, they're saying, well, look, nobody has polio, so how important can this be?
Right. Which is ironic.
Saying, people don't have polio because of the. Yeah, no, I think that's right. There's does that relate to Bayesian thinking, Bayesian analysis?
Help me out because I've studied it at some point, but I can't remember it now.
Well, so I'm actually referring to this. Oh gosh, I'm gonna. I guess now it's time for the episode where Wes mangles a concept and broadcasts it publicly.
By the way, I would be super screwed if this was our out of our depth and you were like Bayesian theory, go. It'd be a very short episode.
No, I've always I still think that like the version of out of our depth that we got to do is the one where neither of us knows, and that's what we're doing right here. Yeah. So this is going to be perfect. There's this. Okay, so it's a math idea that gets applied psychologically to great effect. It's the idea that if you've ever been in a conversation with an uber nerd who says that he or she is going to update his or her priors, then we're talking about Bayesian thinking. The idea is that you're calculating the probability. Well, calculating is too strong a word. You're not a computer, but like you're estimating the probability of various things happening at various points, and occasionally you'll get some new information that tells you, oh, actually, the way I've been calculating this is wrong. I need to sort of adjust my thinking around that. And that turns out to be a really, really hard thing to do psychologically. It's the easiest thing in the world mathematically, but psychologically, it's like that's not how we're set up, right? If lightning strikes somewhere near me, right? The fact that it's a very unlikely event isn't going to change the fact that I'm going to have a hard time not being afraid of lightning for a long time.
Right.
And the fact, that sort of thing. And, but what I'm thinking about is that like, if your data set is that nobody has these diseases, then the risk reward analysis of a vaccine is very different from the analysis if, actually, but for these interventions, they would be rampant and very, very serious. Okay, that's a very different sort of calculation, right? So from my perspective, it's like, okay, I'm kind of miserable today, but like all things considered, a day on which I'm miserable, which I got to anticipate, which I got to plan for, whatever, versus the possibility of on some unexpected day having a much more serious deleterious effect, right? It's like, okay, that's a good trade-off. Yeah. Whereas if it's like, oh, I'm kind of miserable today and that was my choice and I didn't have to be miserable today, well, then I kind of feel like an idiot. Like it really changes the outcome. Anyway, I've gone on a tangent.
Well, yeah, a couple of thoughts related. One is that there's a gap between personal health and like public health, and a gap that people have a really hard time negotiating as well. That's kind of related to that, where basically like sometimes you want to do something personal that's actually for the good of the group. You know what I mean? That's like mildly inconvenient for you. So like that's another sort of like probability calculation where you're like, I can help keep, like I am not going to die of this disease. Suppose you're one of our high school students, right? You're 17 years old, 18 years old. You can get the shot now, right? You're not going to die of COVID. In fact, if you get COVID, you might not even notice that you get COVID, Yeah. So the calculation there is basically I'm going to sacrifice 15, 20 minutes of my time to get this shot for the public good. Right. I'm protecting my teachers and the older people in my grandparents and that kind of stuff. Yeah. It's not really for me. Yeah. And like society, you know what I mean? Everyone, the more of us who do that, the more we protect everybody. You know what's so funny? I was a touring musician back in the day, many, many years ago. And one of the places that we would go was Japan, which, like famously, right? You could leave your wallet on the sidewalk in Tokyo and come back the next day and your wallet would be there. Wow. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like that kind of thing. Super strong sense of the group sort of being more important than the individual. Mm-hmm. And it's so funny because I have this sense of like, oh my gosh, that's a better way to do things. I'm really drawn to that way of thinking. But as soon as I actually look at my own thinking about that, I realize, I want the benefits of that kind of society that I want. I want to dictate the terms under which the group gets elevated above the individual. There are certain things where it's like, I don't want and it's like, oh, well, yeah, I guess I'm an American then. You know what I mean? Like, I really, it's hard for me to think in terms of the group actually being more important than the individual, because even when I say that sounds like a good idea, I'm still doing it on my own individual terms instead of like, you know what I mean? Like there's layers to it. Do I understand? I fully understand. Yeah. Mm-hmm. One other super random story that I just thought that was kind of interesting about individuals. And by the way, as soon as I tell the story, after I tell the story, guess what we're going to do? 10 minutes into this podcast, introduce ourselves. Start the podcast? Sure. All good. The Utah Jazz basketball team recently had like a incident where their plane was taking off and they ran into a flock of birds and they lost at least one engine, but they may have lost two engines, and it was like an emergency situation. They're getting the sort of like, put your head between your legs type of, lecture. Oh boy, hardcore. Yeah. Which now, this is unfortunate. This is what happens when I start telling stories, is that I start telling stories within stories. So here's a story within that one. I was once on a plane where the landing gears weren't confirmed to be sort of like locked in place. And so we were potentially going to have to do a belly landing, it's just like crush all the luggage and, like skid out for a while and just kind of hope for the best. And I was traveling with a woman who happened to be a former flight attendant. And I actually was 16 years old. I was exactly 16 years old when this happened. Okay. And they teach us the crash position. And she says to me, do you know why they teach you how to do this? I was like, no. She's like, to give you something to do? To give you something to do. No, it's an even better line. To kiss your butt goodbye. When we crash. Okay. Yeah, that's a little more realism than I was anticipating from that story. How about that? Yeah, it's an interesting thing to share with a 16-year-old. I've always had like a pretty good head on my shoulders when it comes to crises. So I was like, it's a crazy thing to tell me right now. But anyway, the landing gear did lock in, so we were good. But anyway, back to the Jazz. They ran into this flock of birds. They had to turn around and land at the nearest airstrip, basically. And one of their star players, I think it was Donovan Mitchell, who was already afraid of air travel, he then refused to go to the next game. So they gave him like a personal day. Wait, why did he refuse to? Because he was so shaken? Yeah. It's the lightning example, basically. You know what I mean? It's like lightning has just struck. it's exactly as likely to strike again. I mean, maybe you're in a lightning storm, so I guess it's a little more likely. But you're taking off in an airplane. The risk this time is exactly the same as the risk last time of birds. And in fact, there probably are fewer birds now that you've taken out a couple hundred in your engines. But they gave him like a personal day, and he didn't have to fly to I think it was Memphis for the next game. He just didn't play.
Wow.
Yeah. Didn't take a bus. Didn't play. Yeah.
No, just gonna recover from that. It's funny. I'm still stuck on the fact that Utah Jazz, like my association with Utah Jazz, it's crossword puzzles.
Oh,
that's how big a sports guy I am. It's like it's a sports team that doesn't end with an S.
Oh, right. And right. Good point. And we should also. It's important, and this really should come before we actually introduce ourselves. And that's sarcastic, because like what is wrong with us? You know what I mean? We're this deep into a podcast.
Who knows?
Anyway, let's stop and think about how funny the Utah Jazz is as a team name. It's like literally. Okay, this actually be a pretty fun game. Like, what other like towns and ideas should be less associated with each other, could be less associated with each other than Utah and Jazz.
Oh, I see. So your point isn't that Jazz is a funny name for a team. Your point is that Jazz is a funny name for a Utah team.
Yes, Jazz is a perfect name for a New Orleans team, which is
New Orleans Jazz,
which is the name, which is where that team came from.
I wouldn't know that you were. I wouldn't. Oh, is that right?
Yeah,
they used to be in New Orleans.
They moved.
Oh, yeah.
They moved from New Orleans, and they didn't change the name. You know what I mean? Like
that does seem a little strange.
They should have changed it to the Utah Hymns. You know what I mean? Like the
Utah Hymns.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah,
sure,
that would work.
Like
that would actually make sense.
The Utah Choir.
Exactly. I mean, or the Utah beautiful landscapes. You know what I mean? Like there's a lot. There's stuff in Utah that you can kind of represent and embrace.
And jazz is not one of them.
There's, as far as I know, in fact, I'm pretty sure this is true. There is no jazz in Utah. There are no saxophones.
I really, really want a whole bunch of people who are big fans of Utah Jazz to excoriate us.
Hold on, Utah Jazz the music or Utah Jazz the basketball team?
The music.
Yeah.
No, totally. Well, it's like I was dissing on different geographic regions the other day with you, since we are not in the physical same location, and you pointed out that many times you have this sense that the place where you live has the best of whatever,
right.
And it's just because you don't know what's. So for all I know, there is a thriving jazz scene in Utah, but I don't know.
I've been there. I didn't exhaust the music scene there, but
maybe you just didn't know where to go.
That's true, and I'm so sure there are jazz clubs. That said, if I had my choice, I'd choose about 100 places worldwide to go hear jazz before I chose to go to.
No, that makes a lot of sense.
Salt Lake City.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, exactly.
That person who I'm talking with, the guy up there with the goatee, his name is Wes Carroll. It's spelled with 2 R's and 2 L's. He is located online at wescarroll.com. And he's I just made the comparison to Michael Jordan, and Wes thinks that this is not totally accurate, but I'm going to share it again. So Wes has won the MIT Puzzle Hunt.
Mystery Hunt?
Is it
Yeah. That's the MIT Mystery Hunt.
Mystery Hunt. He has won it 3 times with 2 different teams, of different sizes and different composure. But here's my point with Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan won 6 titles, but did he ever win one with the Washington Wizards? And the answer is he did not. He always needed Scottie Pippen. Pippen was on every single team. So anyway, Wes moved over to the Wizards and then won the title again. That's how smart he is.
That's extremely kind of you to say, and I'm not going to fact check that, because I love the idea that there's some truth in what you say, even though I know, strictly speaking, there are some other.
It's totally misleading. It's highly misleading for sure.
Highly misleading, but warms my heart. The fellow I'm speaking to with curly hair is none other than the Ted Dorsey, found online at tutorted.com. For many, despite my joking about it having been 173 years, you've probably been doing this for 20 years, something like that, right?
Yeah.
Long time.
21, honestly, 21 now.
Yeah. ACT and SAT prep, which it's so funny. I've been I've been talking with peers about tutors in different geographic regions, and well, suffice it to say that that SAT and ACT prep, there's prep and then there's prep, right? There's jumping through the hoops, and then there's learning all the different life skills that the test touches on. And I'm very proud to say about my friend Ted that he's in the superior category, where working with him means not just getting a good score, but actually getting something of, dare I say it, getting something of value out of it other than the score that you're getting. And I think that's super important.
Wow.
Although,
thank you, I appreciate that.
Great scores nonetheless. So
yeah. I mean, exactly. It's like this It's interesting because the score is the primary goal, but getting there is goes through places that basically make you better at working under pressure, in a situation where you're motivated and you need to deliver a result. And that stuff is the stuff that makes you better as a professional, as a student, and a better person. Hopefully, it's
No, I think that makes sense. It's funny to hear you reflect it back, because it occurs to me I kind of put the emphasis on the wrong place when I was saying that, in that it's not like you're using the SAT or the ACT as an excuse to do these other side things. It's that ACT and SAT prep, when done well, wanders into territory that you wouldn't normally think of being associated with that prep, because it's such an all-encompassing like the 4 hours you spend doing that test, right, they're not just a test of whether you know the grammar rules and whether you know these other things. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there, and it takes someone with your level of experience and I think depth of reflection to recognize, this is a kid who needs to memorize XYZ. This is a kid who's having a completely different kind of problem that I've seen before, that I know how to help with. So that I think that a lot of parents, if they watched you doing ACT and SAT prep, would be puzzled as to why are we doing this thing at this time? But the scores come back, and it's like, well, I guess he knew what he was doing. So,
one quick story that's kind of interesting. When I was a younger tutor, when I was in LA, it was like kind of 2005-ish. I had a few students who were homework students. And or like kind of organizational tutoring situations where I'd go to the same.
Oh, I see. Academic prep and
academic prep, and also like it was kind of my task to keep them motivated and to check in on their progress and continuity with their homework and all that stuff. And it was really good work. And some of those students they're like among my favorite students of all time, because we got so connected because we worked with each other for multiple years. I mean, one student in particular, I started with her when she was a 9th grader doing geometry, and I literally worked with her till the last paper she wrote in college. So like that's a long run.
Yeah, for sure.
Such a sweet kid. But the interesting thing, and this is me sharing basically personal stuff about me, that's, I don't know, hopefully interesting, we'll find out, is I stopped doing it at a very specific moment. I stopped doing the homework stuff as I was driving home from my last student with whom I did that. And it was a kid who I had been seeing again since 9th grade. He was finishing senior year of high school. He was going to go to college at Kansas. And that was like a colossal victory. I mean, the fact that he was going to college, period, that he was going to Kansas was like a really great thing. And he was such a sweet kid and really challenged in some interesting ways. But I was driving home from his house, and it was actually a pretty short drive to my place. And I was inconsolable. I was just absolutely like crying the entire drive home, because I was so miserable to have that relationship basically be over in the way that it had, been going on. And it wasn't just like a sweet connection that I had with him. It was, it was that too, but it was like, I was just like heartbroken, you know what I mean? That relationship ended. And so, I said to myself, I was like, I can't do this to myself anymore. You know what I mean? I can't have these relationships.
The relationship had gone on so long and sort of run so deep that when it ended, it was really upsetting. And so, for example, test prep instead of academic prep gave you the chance to have sort of shorter, more targeted. Wow, that is interesting.
Isn't that interesting? And so that's when I literally was like, okay, I've got to do test prep stuff. And now here's the funny thing, and this is what made me think about this recently. I have a student who, and her mother, who I worked with for, about a year and a half. We ended up we did test prep, and then tests shut down, and then we did college essay prep, and I was sort of consulting on her college admissions process, and really sweet kid. We were living 2 hours north of LA, and they lived in LA. They came up recently to visit for lunch. They drove 2 hours to have lunch with me. Very sweet. It's a town that they know that they like. And they came to the house, and I got some sandwiches, and it was very sweet. And I got freaking emotional because, it's like, golly, it's like, you can't do this to me, I thought I got out of this game, but they keep pulling me back in.
Get out the game.
Yeah.
That's funny. I have a very different reaction to that whole I have the same, I don't know, it's just a different spin. So, God bless him. I can't tell you how often I'll get a call from a parent of someone that I worked with years ago, and they'll reintroduce themselves almost always, which is, again, God bless them. It's such a polite thing to do, but it's like they're halfway through, I heard the name, and then they're halfway through explaining who their son or daughter was. And it's like,
I know you.
Of course I know you. I know who you are. I remember yours,
Yeah.
I can pull out stuff which is so funny to me too, because I don't have a good memory by and large, but this is the one thing where it's just of course I remember, that was, I remember what we accomplished. I remember some of the barriers that we, you know what I mean?
Yeah. I definitely know what you mean.
And I think that's part of why it's not as, it's not as heartrending for me when these relationships end, because for me, it's I'm still here if I can be more help to you. And if, if we wind up reconnecting, on a social level later, hey, that's lovely too. And in fact, there are 2 members of my team who were students of mine many, many years ago.
That's cool.
And it's just stuff comes around. So, what do they say? It's not goodbye. It's just so long for now, or I don't know what the expression is, but
I have a former student of mine who I'm seeing on Saturday. And I think she's I can do the math right now. She's in the range of 32 or 33 years old. When I worked with her, I was 25. So considerably younger, then than she is now. And she worked with me.
That's really great.
She did some tutoring, she did some writing, she did some artwork for me. And we've just been connected ever since. And I don't know. It's just you're right. Your emotional perspective on that is very sound. It makes perfect sense. It's this is, it's not goodbye. It's so long for now. That's great.
Yeah. And I think it's really, it's so funny too, because, I don't know, there's sort of a special, the student-teacher relationship is sort of a special sort. I mean, you remember the teachers that really made a difference to you.
I do, yeah.
And yeah, sure. And it's funny too, because on one hand, it is a personal relationship, and yet it is a professional relationship. There's something about the student-teacher thing. How can I say? I guess it comes down to service. I think there's something very special about a relationship in which your role is to support. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I really value about our work, because I grew up in a culture where that was not the primary way that people related to each other, and so to sort of have a piece of my life where that is my role, to be supportive and to get good at being supportive and so on, I think that kind of bleeds out in a lot of good ways. And I don't know. Yeah, I really value that. And it's nice too that I feel like, I was supported as a student, and now I get to sort of pass it along, and in that way kind of, pay back. I'm not saying anything you haven't heard before.
No, of course. Well, I mean, not anything I haven't thought before. I mean, I would say somewhat recently I've been appreciating the personal characteristics of myself that tell me this is a really good job for me. You know what I mean? It's not. Mm-hmm. One could train to be good at this stuff, but I think also you carry with you who you are. You know what I mean? And there are people who are meant to be sort of independent workers, and who are I was fine at doing, say, research or something like that, basically going out and learning something on my own. But I am a really good supporter. You know, like that's like a personality characteristic of mine. And I've learned to embrace that, and not just accept it, but to say like, this is how I operate in a good way. So anyway, I've just been thinking about that.
It's funny too, because, sooner or later we're going to get around to the purported topic of this episode, but what the heck? We're half an hour in or whatever. So why start now? So I went to military academy for high school. I don't know if I've mentioned that to you.
Yeah.
Okay. And one of the things that I find really interesting is some of the ways in which some of the habits that got built in me in that time period come out in my tutoring, but in a very sort of different character, right? So in a military context, right, it's, sergeant says jump, you say how high kind of thing. In a support environment, though, it's just like, I'm going to hold the space here. I'm going to hold you responsible for doing these things. I'm not going to let you weasel out of it. Right. But it's not because I'm being, authoritative. It's because we both agree that to demand of you that you do what is needed is, we agree that is the right outcome. Mm-hmm. And so I'll just, I'll play drill sergeant for you when that supports your end goals. Yeah. And it's just so funny that it's such a different way of thinking about that. I don't know, power relationship. Is that the right way to say it? I really don't know.
Yeah.
In a military context, like, you are subject to someone else's orders or whatever. And in this context, it's like, well, you're not really subject to my orders, but I'm going to hold this recommendation that I'm making very firmly because we've agreed that it's what's called for. So let's do that.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, it's about sort of like authority in a way. Basically like, who's making the decision, who's doing the decision making. In the military context, you've made the decision to be there. Once you've made that decision, then you're kind of like on the hook, and you do what you do what you're told, and that's fine. You've just agreed to it. In the context of my work, I tell my students, I'm like, hey, here are the advantages of jumping right now. You know what I mean? Rather than saying jump this high, I say, I think you ought to consider jumping as a possibility. And as soon as they say, okay, I'm interested, then I'm like, okay, great. Here's a space in which you can jump. If you fall, I will catch you. Why don't you give it a shot? You know what I mean? And then they take the authority to do it. So it's
exactly.
I like that kind of like learning from, not from like direct opposition, but just like learning from experience, making, forging your habits based on what you've seen work in the past or not work. Yeah.
What you've just described sounds so different from what I described, and yet I know that they're exactly like, we're doing the same thing. We're just sort of framing it in very different ways for ourselves. But that's absolutely the process for sure. That's super interesting.
Coming back to not coming back to, because we haven't been there yet. And I'm sure
the topic for today is
exactly. Yeah. So. And it comes back to the vaccine stuff, and of course, it probably comes back to authority and decision making and education and relationships, 100% relationships. Oh my God, we are thinking about the basically the end of pandemic and the return to. The return to normal ?
Even return ?
Yeah, exactly.
The second great adjustment. Yeah.
Like what exactly? What are we what are we coming back to? What have we learned? What is going to be different this time around? And will those lessons from this last year, will they stick? What are they, and will they stick? Basically.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things that keeps coming up for me around this, and, correct me if I'm sort of hitting this from the wrong perspective, because I don't know how objective this is, but I feel like one of the things that's really come up in this last year around education is that a lot of people have gotten a much closer look at what school is and what it isn't.
That's really interesting. Parents have gotten a much closer look, a much better understanding. And and by the way, they're exhausted by it. Do you know why? Because it's exhausting.
That's exactly right. And I don't want to be just, sort of an uncritical cheerleader for schools. I mean, that's not kind of where I'm coming from. But I think with respect to that aspect, there's a lot that goes on there. And when It's not even teachers are better than parents or even better skilled than parents or any, although that may be true, whatever. It's just like we had this division of labor, where the teachers are doing XYZ thing and the parents are doing this other stuff. And when some of it moved from the teacher column to the parent column in the middle of the pandemic, it was like, okay, this just doesn't work. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Thank goodness that thank goodness for small things, right? But in the midst of this horrible pandemic, thank goodness that adults are more strongly affected, as far as we can tell, than kids, because wow, if this were a thing that primarily affected kids, then reopening schools would be all the more fraught, and sort of getting back to that in-person schooling would be all that much harder. And it's like, wow, there was a lot of disruption involved in having school. It's just this thing that you take. Oh, yeah, getting back to the homeostasis thing, right? You take your homeostatic system for granted, and then when it gets pulled out, you realize, right? Oh, yeah, my own temperature regulation really matters to me. It's just that I take it for granted. Same thing with schools, right? Like my kid is at school 5 days a week from this time to that time, and I completely take it for granted. And then when the rug is pulled out from under you, it's like, oh my gosh, this isn't more difficult. This is an unsolvable puzzle that we got to attack from first principles and just grapple with.
And some of that's about education, and some of that is about multitasking too, where it's like people also had to do their jobs. You know what I mean? It's like they were still expected to be full-time employees, and if you had a job, that was like the best case scenario under pandemic. Right. But then you were like, you were both doing your full-time job and the superintendent of a very small school system in your house. I didn't hear you complain about it too much. With your family, all my other friends who are not teachers, I heard it from them in terms of basically they're like, we need to go back to school. And I thought that was sweet, and nothing is objective. You know what I mean? Everything is subjective. And so and I even asked them about that. And one of them, who's like a total researcher, full on, bases his entire professional career around research. He's like, this is not subjective. This is about case rates. And it's like, well, okay, probably it's motivated by something subjective, which is we want our kids out of our houses now. Yeah. How did it go? How did it go for you with your family?
Well, we, knock wood, we got off real easy in a couple different ways. So first of all, I live in a large house that contains two families. My wife's sister's family lives in the same house as us, which means that that our kids and their kids, the cousins, have each other in the same house. And we did that for the purpose of, we wanted the 5 kids, the 2 of ours and the 3 of theirs to grow up together and really know each other, right? Yeah. Not realizing what a boon it would be in the middle of quarantine, right? So the fact that there was this sort of feral pack of, somewhat self-sufficient little kids, or at least self-entertaining little kids, kind of force of chaos, but whatever, was just enormously valuable, because I have all these friends where it's like they've got 1 or 2 kids, and even if you have 2, right, the socialization between 2 people, it's just not the same as sort of the messy dynamics of a 5-way system. Mm-hmm. So we really got lucky in the kids sort of having each other through the whole thing. Yeah. So that was one thing. Yeah. And I think another thing that was really unexpected is that my oldest, who's in first grade, just took to Zoom school. And I mean, I feel bad saying it, because I've heard a lot of stories of not having that experience. But for whatever reason, I don't know, she was just like, yeah, okay, this is, I could put a lot of different things on it, but suffice it to say that the idea of, I think she enjoyed having sort of agency over, her classroom experience in a way that she doesn't normally when it's in person. I don't know. I'm just kind of guessing there, but she's totally been loving it, and really doing well.
You just got at the 2 biggest, my 2 kind of major thoughts that I wanted to get to in this this podcast. So the first one is let me list them out first, because they're both really rich topics, I think. One of them is learning style, which is basically who learns well on Zoom and why, right?
Okay.
So that's one. The second one is, and I've got thoughts on that one, and some kind of like super amateur theories. The other one that I don't have theories about, but I'm super interested in is basically like the function of the one-room schoolhouse. That's always been just like a topic of fascination for me. I'd love to hear what the age. Actually, tell me what's the age range of the 5 kids in your house?
3 to 8.
Okay, so it's pretty. Okay, that's like relatively limited. Like you don't have like a 15-year-old in there or something like that.
Right, and they skew young.
Right.
Although we do have some I don't want to say babysitters, caretakers really. Some of whom are some of whom are teenagers.
Yeah.
Right. So we do get kind of that sort of teenage energy from time to time. Yeah. But I'm sorry.
No. What I think is amazing about, because I think if you'd probably be running your, in-home school pretty similarly if you had a 14 or 15-year-old, right? Or a 12-year-old or 10-year-old, or one of each. I think it's really interesting. I think the idea of the same space being used to teach completely different topics, and the fact that ever worked, which it did, right? And which it can, and it has been sort of like renewed recently because of pandemic, and because of the homeschool movement that's going on right now, is, I don't know. It's I don't like I said, I don't have the answers for this, but I'm just curious.
If we're going to get out of our depth, let's dive into the deep end here. There's a lot to say about this. First thing, so my oldest learned to read somewhat early and really enjoys it, and she enjoys, like I said before, she enjoys feeling that she has agency, that like she is doing the right thing or is helping or is, that sort of thing. And so it's quite common these days. There are 2 3-year-olds in the house. It's quite common to find the first grader, her, sitting on the couch, flanked by 3-year-olds with her reading to them.
Isn't that amazing?
Right? Everybody's happy, right? The 3-year-olds just eat up when anyone reads to them, and meanwhile she's reading and she's showing off her skill, and she knows she's helping, and she all this kind of stuff. It's a lovely thing. At the risk of either saying something that is provably false or sort of obvious to all of our listeners, right? One of the things about the one-room schoolhouse is that it contrasts very sharply with sort of the assembly line origins of modern schooling.
Right. Modern American schooling, yeah.
Modern American schooling, yeah, that's a good point, right? If you get all the 5th graders together in a room, then you can specialize what you're doing to be appropriate for 5th graders.
Today, all 5th graders will learn how to add fractions, right?
Totally.
That's the theory,
Right, and it's not unreasonable on its face. That seems like a pretty good way to organize things, and indeed it does have some really strong advantages. And yet, when you have these different ages mixed, one of the things that I keep seeing is like, they're in some ways they're peers, and in other ways they aren't. Like my oldest is going to read to the 3-year-olds, not the other way around. Right. And the interesting part there is that she gets to experience sort of being in charge of younger kids, but the younger kids get to experience, someone who is sort of their quasi peer taking care of a younger kid themselves in a way that I don't think they're blind to that. I think that they're taking that in.
No doubt.
I think that if there were yet younger kids in the house, they would probably use that as an example of how to behave with other kids. I mean, we'll see how it all plays out, but that seems very clear.
I love that. I mean, and there's great role modeling. There's great, basically like the expectations are set for those younger kids. It's like, eventually I'm going to get to this age, and when I'm that age, I'll be able to read, right?
Yeah.
That's a powerful message. That's a really interesting and valuable part of the one-room schoolhouse.
And there are certain ways in which the kids, like there are aspects of their day that the kids are in charge of that they're simply not in charge of if they're in sort of a complete peer environment, I would think. There was one. Oh, this is only a little related, but it's a funny story. So the other day, I don't want to use their names because
of course, that's a good idea.
But so the older girl is talking to the 7-year-old girl is talking to the 3-year-old boy, and 3-year-old boy is sort of bickering with his 3-year-old cousin, and 7-year-old says, Oh, and they're bickering over the lunch table, right? Because they're sitting next to each other and they're getting in each other's business, and there's just friction. Okay, whatever. They're 3, it's fine. But 7-year-old says, rather than trying to force them apart or anything like that, she says, okay, well, you can sit anywhere you want, you can do whatever you want, but this sandwich that I made for you is going to be sitting over here. And I was just like, pro move, and the interesting thing is, it's like, oh, that's why sometimes as parents we do things the hard way, because why did it occur to her to say that? Because she's seen it modeled by us, right? And it's like every time I do a move like that, there's a piece of me that's rolling my eyes saying, oh my gosh, it would be so much easier if I just separated them. But it's like, yeah, my goal isn't to separate them. My goal is to raise these people, to bring the locus of control, to bring the agency to them over time. And the only way it's going to happen is if I model it 100 times, or it turns out maybe less than 100. But so interesting.
One other thought on the, related to that, on the 7-year-old, making that move is like you truly know something when you can teach it, right? So that is just like the ultimate demonstration, and I've learned that from my own tutoring. It's like sure. now I get it. Now I what I mean. Now I'm not just getting an A on the test. Now I properly understand it. So that emotional lesson that landed. Oh yeah.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny you should say that, because I felt like when I was taking calculus, I felt like I knew what I was doing. And I look back on it now and it's like, okay, I knew some of what I was doing.
Yeah.
But, having taught it a bunch of times, it's like, oh yeah, that's even richer than I realized. It's so interesting.
Yeah.
There's so much there. Yeah, for sure.
Sorry. I was real quick, the tiniest story. Let me tell the quickest story. Yeah. Just sometimes you need to separate the kids. You know what I mean? So, sometimes the very quick story is that my little brother and I we used to go to church.
How much younger?
He is a little over 6 years younger than I am.
Oh wow, quite a gap.
Totally quite a gap. And my maturity should have made this not be an issue, but it didn't. But we used to go to church usually every Saturday night, but sometimes Sunday mornings. And we were, I would say, poorly behaved. And just always, and despite the fact that my parents sort of insisted on sitting near the front, it's like, why are we sitting near the front? Why are we walking all the way up to the front of the? Please don't do that to me.
You know that this is going to end badly for everybody, so let's make different choices.
Exactly. It's like, are you learning? I'm learning, but have you? And so eventually they were like, the one rule of church is that Kevin and Ted cannot sit next to each other. And in fact, we should probably keep 2 people between them rather than just one.
That's pretty funny. Yeah. That is pretty funny. Yeah, I like that.
We had a good time.
But so the reason that I've been bringing all this stuff up is that, so we're talking about getting sort of a better view on schooling and so forth. I think a big thing that's been coming up is that we think of school as doing sort of this reaching these narrowly prescribed sets of goals, right? The goal of 5th grade is to learn XYZ thing. And there's been a lot of effort, especially recently, in sort of categorizing and filing, okay, here are the things that should happen in a 5th grade classroom, and here's how you can tell that they've been done, and all this kind of good stuff. Yeah. And, it's so funny that what we're talking about in this context frames some of the explicit bits of learning as almost secondary to some of the other stuff that's going on. Now, maybe I'm making the same mistake of saying, oh, it's easy for me to frame the school learning part as secondary because I've never seen kids who lacked that thing, who lacked that knowledge. And so it's easy for me to say that the socio-emotional stuff is far more important than the academic stuff, in the same way that it's easy for me to say, oh, I don't need a vaccine if I'm surrounded by, a population that's never seen polio, right? So probably I'm swinging the pendulum too far in the one direction when I suggest that, there's more going on in school than the academic stuff by a wide margin. Yeah. And it's, there's a lot there. And it's not even so much, is school a good idea? Should we change school or any of that stuff? I really come at it more from the perspective of, look, however imperfect any system is, if you run it for a long time, it's going to tend to optimize in various ways. And when you shake up the rules of the game, you shatter, you break so many things. And that's the thing that I think we've really seen in this last year, is that when a teacher who is good at teaching in the context of in-person is asked to manage a Zoom session, whether or not that's going to go well sort of depends on stuff that's completely outside the standard teacher training and experience and so forth. And it's just like, and that's, it's kind of a no fault thing. Like, it's not like, what are you going to do? You got to do the best you can, but you're improvising instead of relying on your deep experience.
That's yeah. Another sort of like, not flawed. I don't want to cast, aspersions here, because I think that's like, it's tempting to do that all the time. You know what I mean? And like just go into this sort of like critique monologue. But
Sure.
I think one thing that happens over time too is that you can lose track of the motivations behind what you're doing, And I think that like the academic standards, like you were saying about like say a goal of 5th grade is to learn long division, right?
Sure.
So eventually, I think people decide that that's the purpose of 5th grade. You know what I mean? That basically, like, right? You've had a successful 5th grade if now you can long divide, and it's weird because it is an important goal. It's a important and like reachable and realistic goal, but is it the point? Is it like, is one 5th grader successful and one not based on that one academic goal? And I think that when you start to focus only on the curriculum, you do lose track of that other critical stuff, the socialization factors, isn't school like almost mostly about socialization? I mean, it's adults who are listening to this. When was the last time you long divided by hand? Despite all the time you spent in 5th grade working on it. Would you ever?
I think I'll take issue with that.
Okay.
I don't think that the point of learning long division is so that you can do long division. Right. In the large, the point of long division is to work on fine motor control, to sort of burn in the idea that there are certain circumstances in which following the steps of the recipe lead to a predictable outcome. Right. There's a certain amount of sort of self-management that's required to hold the problem in your head for the entire time it takes to actually work through the method. Right. Like, these are the things that actually echo back later. Like, whether you can do long division, obviously you're right, nobody cares. But in learning long division, you sort of baked in some of these sort of sub skills that you exercise all the time, even as an adult.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, that's absolutely spot on. And I know you meant to disagree with me, but
doing the best I can.
No, it's good. It's good. And I guess my point is that I think that we've lost sight of that. You know what I mean? I think that the really good teachers probably still understand that. But on the report card, it basically says Johnny doesn't get long division. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Versus Johnny is having an issue understanding that sometimes following a protocol is the best way to solve a problem. You know what I mean? And it is sometimes, and sometimes it's not. But that's, I don't know. It's
So related topic. Weigh in. So one of the things that I've discovered is the amount of Zoom school that my 1st grader does is, as you might imagine, limited. And I hope it would be clear to all listeners that that all kinds of bad things would probably be happening if they tried to put her on Zoom for 6 or 8 hours a day. Like the fact that it's limited, right, seems very sensible to me. Yeah. The thing that I'm finding so interesting is that, as far as I can tell, she's learning everything she needs to learn in a relatively small amount of her day, it seems to me. Now, she does homework and stuff, and we talk about some of the stuff that she does in school, so maybe that's maybe I'm skewing the data there. Yeah. But it's really interesting to me that it's like, okay, she doesn't have all that much formal schooling, and yet she's clearly learning the stuff. And in fact, the funny, she's in a bilingual school. Like, the thing that's really causing trouble is that we don't speak that second language at home, which is just like, what are we thinking? We really got to, anyway, that's a parental failing. But when it comes to like all the sort of the formal goals, it's like, she's totally doing great. I realize I brought this up just because it's self-serving for us to talk about how great, relatively personalized instruction is and how quickly you can get stuff done.
Well, but I'm sorry to say, and I've said it before, and I'll always say it, that that tutoring is the the most effective form of education. And I'm not, that's not an opinion, that's research.
Yeah, totally.
But I think, I don't find that to be a parental failing, by the way. I think that, being in a bilingual school is a chance to
failing is too strong, but it would certainly be nice if we put more effort into learning the target language ourselves.
Let me ask you this question.
Sure.
How long does learning take?
I'm sorry, what?
How long does it take to learn something?
I'm sorry, I can't parse that. What?
I would say
I want to give you kind of a sarcastic, snide answer to
demonstrate
how many
different
fun ways I could.
Oh no, that's part of the point, I would say too. But different contexts.
I'll give you my snide answer.
Okay.
I'll give you my snide answer. If you're measuring it in those terms, you're not doing the job of learning.
Right. Yeah,
it's like, oh my gosh, like it's a lifelong pursuit. I mean, I'm not saying don't have goals. I'm not saying don't have milestones. I'm just saying, like, if it's a thing that you're checking off on your list of stuff to do today, you're fundamentally doing it wrong. Although I guess you can break it down, right? I learned 50 vocabulary words in the target language today. Okay, that counts, right? But is that learning? Well, yeah,
it's part of it, right?
Sure.
That's a step in the process. And once you've got those vocabulary words, if you just memorize them on the flashcard, and actually this is actually going to bring me back to learning style. In Zoom, if you just know them from front and back of a flashcard,
sure,
then you know them in one context that is not especially generalizable. Is that a word?
I am.
You can disagree with me, and I will come back so hard. It's fine. It's fine. You're totally allowed to disagree. But my point is, if with vocabulary specifically and a language, the point is usage, right? The point is applicability. And I am not saying that vocabulary flashcard training is useless. I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is, if you only learn it in that context and you then don't use it, then you haven't done anything that's significantly valuable.
Oh no, that's fine. No, we're not going to argue about that. But what I will say is, for sure. Like the reason that it's important to do the vocabulary drills from in my own personal experience, right? The reason it's important to do the vocabulary drills is so that when I am attempting to speak in the target language and I hit that word that I didn't know last week, like it appears in front of me and it appears on the sort of virtual heads-up display behind my eyeballs, right? And I'm able to read it off the flashcard I envision, which enables me to get through the conversational piece. And like the whole point of that is, okay, after I've done that 10 times, the part of my brain responsible for speaking will actually associate that foreign set of syllables with the concept that it's supposed to be instead of bridging it through a vocabulary card. But like the most important thing is it gets me through the sentence and makes me feel more comfortable in the target language rather than making me feel self-conscious. So it's valuable, but I'm sorry.
Totally. No, it's 100% a bridge to learning. Yeah.
Totally.
I've heard the number before, 60 to 80 exposures. That's what it takes to learn specifically a new vocabulary word.
That seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I don't know one way or the other, but that doesn't seem
they happen faster than I think that they happen more frequently than you might expect. So like if you're counting them or trying to remember the last 60 times you saw a Spanish vocabulary word or something like that, then it might. I don't know.
There are certain concepts and certain phrases in languages that are not my native language that are stored in the place in my brain that is reserved for native language.
Yeah, totally.
And I'm sure that I'm saying that with like 70 or 80% confidence that like there are listeners who know me to be wrong, but like that is my lived experience, independent of whether whether that's true or not. It certainly feels very true to me. And it's like there's
and you and I have done research on education, and we're also operating from our both personal experiences, like how we've seen. So I don't think there's anything wrong with bringing that information in, but the application to pandemic learning is, for me, if you're learning on Zoom, that is a context. And you have to be able to go outside of that context. And so like, I'm glad that your first grader isn't just on Zoom, is learning something. And this comes back to my, how long does it take to learn something question, which totally is like Confucian, like it's not, this is not, it's not an answerable question, I don't think. Or you could spend the rest of your life answering it if you wanted to, and that'd be kind of interesting.
Well, I mean, and to illustrate it, right? When am I going to learn to be a great husband?
Right.
I like learning because there's a lot of different concepts.
I wish Audrey were here and we could ask her.
Yeah, totally. No. Exactly.
There's a lot of ways to ask that question.
As well. Yeah, there are. Yeah, you might be walking into a lion's den on that one.
I just think that like there's, and I wish I knew a little bit more about learning styles in terms of, are you sort of like because I know this stuff sort of like.
Let me debunk the common myth there before you even get into it.
Yeah, go for it.
The idea that there are auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learners has been thoroughly debunked, right? But and yet, I'm not saying that just to beat the research over the brains who beat the research over the heads of people who disagree with that conclusion. That's not where I'm coming from. Like it isn't that the research has said there's no value in choosing the style. That's not what the research says. The research says that if you prefer one of those three modes, that's not an intrinsic property of you. That's a learned property of you that can be altered, right? So the mental model is if you're accustomed to reading books on podcasts or in audiobooks, whatever, right? It's like then to some degree, your brain has sort of rearranged and optimized itself to take in that kind of information in that context. Right? Like you may genuinely be more comfortable retaining details from a book that is read to you, right? It's just that it doesn't make you an intrinsically auditory learner. It means that you're practiced at a skill that perhaps I'm not as practiced at. And, it may be that I'm splitting hairs, right? You listen to an audiobook, I prefer to read it on the page and like, whatever, it's fine. It's just that it is, what's the word I'm looking for? Flexible, malleable, can't be changed.
Learnable. Well, and learnable, I would say it's practice, but there is some skill component to it as well. Like I had this one student recently. God, she was so much fun. She was so interesting. I would be nowhere. I would not be doing this job still if my students weren't so interesting. I mean, it's
Amen to that.
Such a gift.
Amen to that. Oh yeah.
This particular,
if I had the skill of some of my students when I were a student myself, my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, totally. This particular student was an artist, made a lot of art, and she had like a really strong 3-dimensional reasoning skill. Right? So she basically... You mean
like could solve Rubik's Cubes and pack the car with more stuff for the camping trip than seems like ought to fit in there, that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, yeah. No, that's probably... Both of those things are probably true, but she was... Basically, when we did 3D, geometry questions and you're sort of like imagining diagonals in space and, 2-dimensional spaces intersecting with 3-dimensional spaces.
Oh, she had a really good sense of like how it all...
100%. She was at 100% on that, and she was... But she also was not a particularly good math student. You know what I mean? And that could have been related to a bunch of other factors, and it could have had to do with interest. It could have had to do with practice and skill, or whatever. Or it could have had to do with the teachers that she had.
Sure. We see that all the time.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. That's
and not even just bad teachers, just teachers that you don't gel with for whatever reason.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm a really good learner, but I'm not a great learner with every teacher. That's for sure.
Yeah, sure.
Nor am I the best teacher for every student either.
Amen to that. Sure.
But she. What was my ultimate point here? I mean, I guess just that, like, that I think that part of that was skill. Part of that was, like she was. There's sort of like a nature nurture, argument to make that there is nature, and she probably came into this world as someone who is going to be good at 3-dimensional reasoning, or who was preternaturally gifted at that. Yeah. So anyway, I guess my point about Zoom and learning style is I just hope that we take the lessons that we learned in the Zoom classroom and pull them out and apply them in other contexts. Because I do think that like the vocabulary flashcard learning, like I said, is it is the example. If you then pull that into your life and you start using those words and you're even visualizing the flashcards as you do it, eventually you get to stop visualizing the flashcards, which makes the flashcards like highly valuable. Oh gosh, really? You're
really scratching the surface here, or deeper than the surface, of the difference between intellectualization and just wisdom, right? Like one of the things that keeps coming up in different, I haven't thought of it in these terms before, but like so much of what we've been doing this last year has been kind of scrambling to figure out how to make the best of this bad situation. All right, let's try it this way. Let's try it this way. It's a lot of intellectualization in a lot of cases of like, okay, here are the constraints. Let's see if we can, like I said before, solve this problem from first principles and come up with a Zoom classroom, that sucks less than maybe what our first impression would have been, whatever. But wisdom is kind of looking at the situation and saying, I have the experience, like I don't have experience of having lived through a pandemic before, but I can just feel that this kind of solution is going to work and this one isn't, right? There's that sort of, fast and slow Kahneman, two systems of thinking kind of thing happening. And I think part of what we've been dancing around here is that, how can I say this? I guess I'd say that there's sort of two different poles to learning, two different ends of a spectrum. And part of the art of it is sort of placing yourself somewhere in the middle of that spectrum. On one end of the spectrum is the super slice and dice, like here are our formal goals. Here is, you are going to learn long division in fifth grade, all this kind of stuff. Like there is value in knowing everyone's going to finish fifth grade, knowing long division, or else there's going to be an intervention because we've decided that's like whatever.
Right.
That is one thing. But to your point, it's not the whole thing, right? There's also this other thing of we're going to get through fifth grade being a more mature and capable human being / citizen, whatever, and that takes a lot of different forms, and the reality of it is somewhere in between. And it's not an either or thing. It's not a zero sum game. Part of it is like like we were saying before, in learning long division, you're learning to direct your own attention. You're learning to direct the movement of the pencil on the paper. You're learning patience, right? And these sub skills are going to get applied to all these other things that you're doing. So in that sense, I'm increasingly, maybe this is just me getting old and crotchety, but I'm increasingly come around to this idea that like it's not about building the perfect school system, or for that matter, building the perfect tutoring system for my own clients that's going to handle every eventuality. It's really more about, okay, you know what? Here's an oyster. We've got a good collection of different kinds of sand. Let's put some sand in the oyster. Let's see what makes a pearl best. And then let's just get all the environment set up so that pearl creation can happen without any other roadblocks. And when I say it that way, I almost feel like I sound like an idiot because I'm sort of I'm papering over all the complexities that go into that. But again, it's kind of like, well, that's what wisdom is, right? Is when you don't need to be looking at all the details to know, like, this is what we're trying to do here. And we don't know all the details of how it's going to work, but we know it's going to work. And if it doesn't, we know what, different interventions we're going to undertake to sort of get things back on track. It's just, I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's. I mean, it leads me to asking a question that I almost think we should like end on and maybe take up as the next topic.
Okay. Yeah, let's have it.
Yeah. So you can see behind me, there's some art. Well, if you're listening, you can't. I always make that. I always make that mistake.
I see it in my mind's eye.
Yeah, visualize two pieces of art hanging behind my head.
You know what? I can't actually see that. They're slightly off camera from my perspective. So tell me.
Okay, yeah. One's
just the corner.
One's a print from an artist who works out of Shepard Fairey's studio in LA in Echo Park, and the other one is another
Echo Park. You say
Echo Park.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Mm-hmm.
Are you echoing?
A lot of good
Echo
association. Well, yeah. I guess I am. But a lot of good associations. There's a musician I used to be really into who's based in Echo Park, and I've been there a couple of times, even though I'm not much of an LA guy. But
nice. Yeah.
Lovely area.
The other piece is another Echo Park artist, which is funny.
Oh, okay.
I think he actually moved further east. Anyway, it's and that's an original. But the point of pointing to the artwork is that when I was hanging them up, I was thinking about how I should be doing it. And I remembered a physics experiment from high school where we had like a ramp made of rulers, and it was pretty well precisely constructed at a certain angle, and you could see what like they had the protractor and everything. You could see what the angle was, and you could see what the length was. And the goal of the challenge was basically you're going to release a pool ball from this spot. Can you predict where it's going to land? And the answer is, of course, you can. You basically, use the acceleration due to gravity and the sort of like,
sure.
I don't know if it was
There's a
momentum.
recipe.
There's a recipe, exactly.
Yeah.
And I was really good at the math side of that. You know what I mean? I could do the equations, and it was like, here it is to 3 decimal places, where it's going to land. And then there was the sort of like execution side of things, which is basically how do you measure on the ground where that's going to be? How do you put that? Where do you put the dot, right? And so my physics teacher was giving me crap, and he was just this sort of like, can I still do an imitation of him? Let's see if I can.
Well, gosh, we're going to find out, right?
Let's try. I won't name him because that's that's not that polite. But he was like,
all right.
Oh, so there's some students are. It's not very good. It doesn't matter, really. No one knows.
But it's an enjoyable voice. I'm going to challenge you to continue.
Great.
Finish the story in the voice, even if it isn't a fair representation.
In my head, it's perfect. But the problem, actually, one of my problems with imitations is that as soon as I start thinking about doing an imitation, they're terrible. When I'm not thinking about it,
so we're done. Yeah,
then
it works out.
Sometimes in a moment, you're just like, oh my God, like that was President Obama. You know what I mean? It's,
yeah, exactly. Okay, I withdraw my request.
So he's like, well, some of the students seem to have some methods of measuring that are a little bit suspect. And he's like looking at me the whole time. It's like, why don't you just tell me? Why don't you walk over and like give me a little guidance? You know what I mean? You dick. Anyway, here's the point. I did my thing, which was not his thing. His thing was basically like, you plumb the bottom of the ramp with like a weight and a string, and then you measure from there. And his way, here's the thing, his way does work. And his way is more reliable than my way was. My way, however, also worked. And so the point of the art thing is, as I was hanging that stuff up and thinking about that physics teacher and thinking like, what you should be doing is using a measuring tape and a level and all this stuff rather than using your hand as sort of this like improvisational measuring tool, So basically what I was doing, I was kind of using holding onto the wire on the back of the painting and making sure it's going to hang this far down and this is about the center and improvising a solution, right?
Yeah.
So this is such a long-winded story to get to such a simple point. I decided eventually as I was doing that and as I was like starting to kind of critique myself for doing it my way rather than, the sort of like I don't know, like industrially most efficient way, I was like, maybe my way's fine. Maybe my way works. Maybe I'm really happy with my way. And if it does work, I think that's fine. So the topic that I'm kind of proposing is like what works for the individual versus what works for the group, and if different methods. Go ahead. That's a great,
like, okay, I know we're ending on this, but just a couple things to throw out there, right? Like, first of all, there's sort of 2 embedded questions there. There's the difference between what works for you and what works for the group. And there's the question of what works for you versus what works for me. Because those are 2 different things. Like, for example, for you, it may be that having things that are a little bit askew feels more welcoming for whatever reason. Whereas it may
hold on, hang on. I just want to make sure those of you who are just listening on the podcast,
it's not askew.
It's not askew.
It's dead level. Okay, fair enough. But fair enough. So in that case, it's not about the final presentation. It's about just every time you look at it, that you did that by hand, and that's more satisfying for you than knowing that you used a laser level and blah 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 blah. And that makes that makes sense to me. I did not mean to impugn your sense of. But the other piece of it is
the only reason I jumped in on that was just basically just to say that like just because
it's not about a less than
exactly the point is not like learn to settle, the point is learn to do it in the way that works for you.
Yeah, I think that's right. So the thing is, if you have 30 people in a setting, if you have 30 kids in a classroom and everyone's doing it their own way, well, actually, let me say this a little more provocatively. If everyone's doing it their own way, it's simply harder to be the teacher in that classroom. Yeah. It's not that it can't be done. It's just that it's harder. And if you're making things harder for the teacher, then you're paying a cost somewhere else in having that be the case. But again, we're getting back to like teaching versus tutoring, group work versus individual individual work, and so on. And I'm happy to be part of I've had language tutors and I've had language classes. And sometimes a language class, in particular, a conversational group can be super helpful because, learning a language, you're going to spend more of your time listening than talking anyway. So it makes sense that, that kind of thing. But I'm not down with, okay, we're all going to do this thing together in this particular way, because it's like, yeah, generally speaking, that's going to be optimized for keeping everyone together, not optimized for me learning as quickly as I possibly can. And that's true for everyone else in the room too. Yeah, there's a lot there. I like that a lot.
Yeah. Well, let's hold that. We'll do that next time. That'll be interesting.
That sounds great.
His name is Wes Carroll. He's on the web at wescarroll.com. Am I allowed to do this? Yeah. Okay, great.
His name is Ted Dorsey, Tutor Ted, TUTORTED.com, meeting all your ACT and SAT prep needs and many other things, as we've learned in this episode since 1865. Thanks for hanging with us. Click subscribe, ring the bell, tell a friend, leave a comment. You know the drill.